We're now joined by Kevin Sanders, Director of War and Peace Foundation in New York. Thank you for joining us. Let's start off. The US President is in Russia now to discuss Washington's plans for a missile shield in Europe. But as we've heard, even the White House is admitting itself that a major agreement is highly unlikely. How exactly will Russia's strong opposition impact the two countries' ties in the long run?
Well, I think that probably it'll be welcome to everybody concerned when a new administration comes in. These are the last days of Starwars, or Strategic Defense Initiative, or Missile Defense, whatever you want to call it. It began back in the age of Reagan, and when Reagan suddenly burst out with this crazy idea, it was described at that time by then President Gorbachev as insane. And Putin obviously thinks the same thing about it. And when Putin's gone, then Medvedev will think the same, because it is insane. And the fact that NATO has endorsed it doesn't really mean anything, because the same people who are behind NATO, who control NATO, who are NATO, are the same people who have been pushing this crazy idea of Star Wars, which is 20 or 30 big international military, industrial, aerospace contractors. They're the only people who gain anything from this. And they've gained a lot, tens of billions of dollars over all these years. It was thought in the time of Clinton that it was over. There was a time 10 years ago or so when headlines were that Star Wars is dead, and everyone thought, mercifully welcome death. And then when Bush came into office, one of the first things he did was to revive it. And it's sort of been struggling around ever since. But I think with the obvious refusal of the Russians to cooperate with it, and the assurances that Obama, almost certainly the next president of the United States, has given, that he will have nothing to do with the weaponization of space, I think that the talks now in Russia pretty much mark the end of the whole idea of Star Wars.
Well, let's talk about the conversation between the two sides. I mean, they're downplaying it almost. President Putin's dismissed the chances of a new Cold War, and President Bush is denying that there's any tension between Washington and Moscow outright. But what's really going on? Where is the situation heading?
Well, I think it is ending it's a face-saving device for Bush. There's nothing that Bush can really do anymore. He's a lame duck president. He's on the way out, and when he's out, he's not going to be involved in affairs at all. Putin is, but Bush is not. At the end of Bush's term of office, he'll be lucky if anybody even takes his phone calls. Bush is really thoroughly discredited, and as is Star Wars. And I think that. I think it is pretty clear that it was a terribly dangerous and destabilizing idea from the beginning. It is a situation as though it were two men facing each other with swords, which is an unhealthy situation at any time. They should be working to get their swords out of the way and to find peace. But to have a situation in which one of the sides suddenly says, I'm going to get a shield, then that immediately destabilizes the entire strategic structure and immediately gives rise to the suspicion that that person with the shield is planning a first strike. And that has been the basis of the concerns all along.
Sanders, sorry to cut you in there. Let's move on to the NATO summit, of course, this week in Romania. And did Russia get sufficient concessions on the part of NATO in Bucharest, would you say?
Well, that's going to take a long time to work out. NATO itself is really an obsolete organization. I think historically its role has passed. The trouble with the institutions is that they outlive their death. NATO really should have closed down at the end of the Cold War. All it can do is range around making trouble and creating a huge budget for the arms that the big military, industrial, aerospace contractors who are behind it have been very eager to promote and to continue. But NATO is really not equipped to handle the problems of the present and the future. So I think in the long view, although more and more people may make their way into NATO, the whole concept of NATO as a useful, intelligent, functioning force is fading.
Well, as you said yourself there, I mean, like you're saying, it may be a failing institution, but as you said yourself, more countries are trying to get in there, and of course that raises opposition from other countries.
Right.
For example, France and Germany, they could only raise their objection to Georgia and Ukraine's membership of NATO, but they weren't able to take that concept off the table completely. Why is that?
Well, obviously, NATO would like to have more members. They would like to have particularly former elements of the once Soviet Union. So there are political forces here. It's not really a military organization. It doesn't really serve a military purpose. It's essentially a political structure, and it's the shadows still of the Cold War. I suppose there's a certain amount of wishful thinking on my part when I say I'd like to see it fade. It will fade, but slowly, and as I say, more nations will come into it, but probably. But that will become ever more meaningless, as there's no real role for NATO anymore.
And Mr. Sanders, just finally, picking up on something you said a bit earlier, you said the same people who are NATO are the same people who are pushing the idea of this missile shield in Europe. Many people we speak to here at Press TV and other analysts say that the military alliance is just a US-run show. What do you make of that comment?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's, although the elements of the military complex are international, they're overwhelmingly dominated by the United States. The idea of NATO came from the United States. The idea of Starwars came from the United States. And so therefore, with a change of administration, a change of leadership in the United States, which is imminent and highly likely, we are likely to see a very sudden change in the whole structure of NATO, probably almost certainly see an end to the idea of Star Wars, and a complete realignment of the global power structure as the world moves into an entirely new era, and under the guidance of probably the first truly global president that the United States has ever had.
Well, Kevin Sanders, we will just have to wait and see. As always, thank you for joining us. That was Kevin Sanders, Director of the War and Peace Foundation in New York.